So hello everyone, and firstly thank you to the organisers for inviting me to this conference and to those who have taken the time to be here today. My name is Rainey and I am a board member and researcher at 50/50 NI, which is a non-profit organisation based in Northern Ireland that aims to get more women into politics by providing training opportunities as well as advocating to political parties to become more gender inclusive. And over the past year, we've been developing this research, analysing women in electoral politics in Northern Ireland, with the aim to establish a baseline marker for where women are at, but to also see how gender norms and structural barriers are impacting women's political participation. And we used the Northern Ireland Assembly election last year in 2022 as a bit of a case study to do this. So just kicking in with a review of literature. Women's underrepresentation in politics is not an exclusive phenomenon affecting only Northern Ireland. Rather, it remains to be a global issue. The Interparliamentary Union records that just 26.5% of women in lower chambers in parliaments. And according to UN Women, only 6 countries in the world have 50% or more women in parliament, while only 23 countries have surpassed 40% of women's representation in parliament. UN Women also estimates that at the current rate of progress, gender parity in national legislative bodies will not be achieved before 2063. And the European Institute for Gender Equality, EGA, has also signalled its concerns about the lack of progress in increasing women's representation in decision-making. EGA's gender and statistics database indicates that women represent only 33.2% of elected members to national parliaments in the EU and 34.7% in regional assemblies across the EU 27 member states. And for a regional comparison, at present, 34.5% of elected parliamentarians are women in the UK House of Commons, while 23.1% are women in the Dáil Éireann in Ireland. The UK Regional Assembly average for women's representation is 42.4%, with the London Assembly, Welsh Senate and Scottish Parliament contributing to closing the gender gap quite significantly, despite Northern Ireland. Parallels between political cultures in Northern Ireland and Ireland are often made, as in both jurisdictions on the island of Ireland, they tend to give women's representation a low priority. Other literature insights we found focused on why it is important to get more women into politics, especially in contexts like Northern Ireland, where peace building and political processes are essential for stabilising post-conflict regions. Despite making up more than half the population, women are still underrepresented in political bodies where policy and decisions made still skew towards a male perspective, which means that currently more than half the population are being underserved due to their gender. Research also highlights that women tend to work more collaboratively and bipartisan while working in politics. And we saw a good example of this leading up to the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, where the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition played a vital role in ensuring that peace talks remained on track and were constructive. And for legal frameworks, Article 7 of CEDAW and the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which specifically outlines that women's equal participation in decision-making is not only a demand for simple justice or democracy, but can also be seen as a necessary condition for women's interests to be taken into account. And despite the precedents that international legislation provided, the design for participating in the Northern Ireland peace talks, which started in 1996, took no affirmative measures to ensure that women's participation. It was luckily enough that the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition did get enough votes to access talks. The peace agreement and legislation that followed the negotiations by today's standard would be considered subpar in how limited gender was integrated, and what provisions there are fail to account for how gender equality in peace building and within the political institutions would be achieved. Furthermore, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security commits to protecting women's rights and guaranteeing their equal participation in peace processes. However, even though the UK has affirmed its commitment to implementing the resolution internationally, it has stated that there are no plans to integrate provisions relating to the implementation of Resolution 1325 for Northern Ireland into the UK's National Action Plan. Like in other divided societies, the focus of power sharing tends to emphasize ethnic dimensions for social inclusion, while ignoring the intersection of other identity markers such as gender or class as being important in peace building. And much of the literature we found also focused on the barriers that are preventing women from entering politics, which can be summarized into the 5 C's: childcare, cash, culture, confidence, and candidate procedures. So women spend double the amount of time on childcare compared to men, highlighting prevailing gender roles around caregiving. This contributes to the nature of women's employment in Northern Ireland, which is highly characterised by gender-segregated labour markets. The political systems established from the peace process were constructed under the same lens of gender roles and stereotypes, just as the rest of society. The gender gap in financial well-being poses a substantial impediment to women seeking to participate in political life, particularly associated with the costs of running a political campaign, as women tend to have less access to financial resources than men. The primary caregiver role also limits the scope and potential for women to access those intangible resources associated with funding, such as human, social, and reputational capital. The culture which is embedded and surrounds political life can be argued to be the toughest barrier to tackle due to its layered, multidimensional, and pervasive nature. This includes the dominance of masculinity in political parties and governing institutions, gender bias in media, as well as the prevalence of online gender-based violence. The confidence gap is also attributed to being a leading factor in women's underrepresentation in politics. Women are socialized to adopt modesty norms from childhood as a means to ensure they adhere to gender expectations. Political parties remain to be the gatekeepers in who stands for election. Research suggests that informal criteria for candidate selection leads to the reproduction and maintenance of male dominance in politics. And for our methodology, we decided to employ a mixed methods approach of quantitative and qualitative data. For our quantitative data, we use secondary sources, which were compiled lists from the Assembly website and the Electoral Office, which we then disaggregated into categories, including existing MLAs, election candidates, gender and political parties, constituencies, as well as diversity beyond gender. We did take a binary approach to assigning gender, and we mainly relied on that person's gender expression, such as their pronouns, to make that judgment. We assessed gender representation in 3 stages: before the election, during the election, and post-election. And we used the percentage average to determine whether the threshold for gender balance or gender parity had been met. And for qualitative data, we conducted a series of semi-structured interviews with women in politics from across the political spectrum and at different levels of political participation. These interviews were conducted over Zoom, which were recorded, and the audio was then transcribed into text, which was then verified by the interviewees. We coded recurring themes within the transcribed text and generated them into preconceived themes. And there were several limitations of our research. The biggest one was that we were relying on making qualitative assessments to determine gender and other types of diversity, as public information collected by official bodies does not exist on this type of diversity. We also experienced difficulties with timing, as we would have liked to have got more women to be interviewed leading up to election. And we found it difficult to get responses to requests. Now, some of the findings that we have, out of the 239 candidates that ran in the Assembly election, 35% were women. And it is also important to note that from that number of women, 65% of them were non-incumbent candidates. 33 women were elected or co-opted to the Assembly, which had brought about no change at all, as it was the same percentage even before the election. And here we have a bit of a time series analysis when reviewing the growth of women's representation in Northern Ireland since the first election in 1998. Progress had been slow until 2016, when there was a jump from 17% to 28%. And since then, we've had two elections, one in 2017 and the other last year in 2022, where there was an increase from 31% to 37%. And of the 5 largest political parties in Northern Ireland, 137 candidates were nominated to stand for election, and 42% constituted women. Sinn Féin and Alliance Party had gender parity among their candidates, where the SDLP reached gender balance. The UUP had 33% of women among their candidates, and the DUP had 23%. The only political party whose women were more successful than their male counterparts was Sinn Féin, with 55% being elected. The Alliance Party achieved close to gender parity with 47%, while SDLP and DUP had less than 30% of candidates elected, and the UUP failed to get any of their 9 women candidates elected. And in Northern Ireland, we have 18 constituencies with 5 MLAs, members of the Legislative Assembly, per constituency. After the election, there were several changes to the gender composition in constituencies. Firstly, the number of all-men constituencies decreased, with 2 of the previous 3 electing 1 woman each. However, the number of gender-balanced constituencies also decreased, bringing the number of constituencies with only 1 woman MLA to 7. The number of constituencies that reached gender parity remained the same. And in the capital city of Northern Ireland, which is Belfast and also my home, we have 4 electoral boundaries, and currently women make up 45% of MLAs, which is a 5% drop from prior to the election. And what we've managed to gather on other types of diversity, because as I mentioned earlier, there is no data on this, official data on this, has relied upon making qualitative judgments on the expressions and visible identity of people to try and bring an intersectional approach to what we're doing. So prior to the election, the Assembly had no ethnic representation at all. 2 out of the 239 candidates that we know of were Black, and sadly, neither were elected. We are doing slightly better with LGBTQI representation, though. Prior to the election, we had 1 openly out gay MLA, and as far as we know, 13 candidates came from the LGBTQI community, with 3 of them being elected. And for qualitative findings, we observed 4 themes. As I mentioned earlier, they were preconceived themes, and these are the first 2, motivation and recruitment and selection. So for motivation, the ongoing political dysfunction of politics in Northern Ireland and British politics more generally was a source of great frustration for many of the women interviewed, whereby they felt compelled to enter politics to make a difference. Many of the interviewees said that it was a specific policy area that drew them into politics, and our findings show that policy interests among the women interviewed were quite diverse. Almost all candidates interviewed stated that they believed their lived experience and perspective as women in policymaking were important. The experiences and processes of how women were recruited and selected to enter electoral politics differ across political parties. Many of the women were already engaged in their local communities through civil society and grassroots activism, and were recruited to join a political party to stand for election based on their local recognition. Other women enter party membership through family involvement, meaning that intergenerational legacies and name recognition garnered support for their candidacy. Some of the women cited that it was important to already be involved in community or political activism before entering electoral politics. Several of the women highlighted that they were reluctant to put themselves forward as a candidate, but encouragement by either the local select group or the central level of the party, it basically gave them the push. Already being an elected councillor enhanced the confidence of women to put themselves forward for the assembly election. And it was also noted that co-opted seats previously held by men gave women the chance to enter local governance. Lastly, some women cited that concerted efforts by the party to run more women for election, either through formalized gender quotas or informal strategies, played a central role in their candidacy nomination. And the other two themes, barriers and solutions. So for barriers, all women interviewed stated that the lack of work-life balance as being the biggest barrier to entering politics. Some of them stated that they had remained to be the primary caregiver to small children. Therefore, the scheduling times for committee and other meetings often make it difficult for women to participate. Some of the women interviewed shared that they had to discuss standing for election with their families first and what that would mean for them if they were elected. Furthermore, all the women interviewed cited that the lack of confidence was a major barrier, as there is a tendency for women to feel that they are not qualified enough to be in politics. Online gender-based violence was cited by all the women interviewed as being a deterrent to entering political life, as many of them outlined their own experiences of online abuse or that of their colleagues. Furthermore, cultures of misogyny were highlighted as being a problem, especially in some councils where derogatory remarks and casual sexism are common occurrences. It was also highlighted that young women in these spaces often face discrimination based on their gender and their age. Lastly, many women noted that the lack of diversity in politics was a problem and that not enough was being done to address it. For solutions, the common theme in many of the suggestions made by the women interviewed was the need for gender-sensitive policies for inclusive governing, which includes provisions for maternity or shared parental leave, childcare benefits or facilities, hybrid models for working to make participation more accessible. Several of the interviewees stated that they believe changing the culture of politics from being adversarial to being more collaborative would make entering and staying in politics more attractive. To address the confidence gap, many believe that mentoring programs and engaging young women by showcasing role models would help the next generation of women come forward. Additionally, several women noted that legalized gender quotas could force political parties to implement a gender strategy along with their election strategies. And almost all the women interviewed stated that more needed to be done to address online violence, with several stating that education could play a fundamental role in combating gender-based violence. And for discussion and conclusions, the first being is that the lack of women's representation in Northern Ireland is not down to gender bias in voters, but is in fact because not enough of them are being put forward as candidates by political parties. What we found is that when there was less than 35% of women running in a constituency, it led to only one woman being elected. Non-incumbent women candidates who ran alongside male incumbent candidates from the same party for the same constituency were often not elected compared to their male colleagues. Women were also placed in non-competitive races, meaning that the electoral record of their party for a particular area was not expected to meet the threshold to be elected. The overall increase in gender representation in the in election candidates for the Assembly in 2022 can be attributed to political parties with formalized or informal affirmative measures. Research suggests that progress in women's representation runs along ideological lines, and that the findings in our study would corroborate with that assertion. Political parties in Northern Ireland who tend to look more positively towards affirmative measures put forward gender balanced lists of candidates for election. Therefore, structural and cultural issues within political parties remain to be the biggest barrier that are holding women back from advancing in politics. And all the women we interviewed believed that more could be done to make political participation more accessible. When reviewing ways in which to make legislative bodies more gender sensitive, we focused on 4 dimensions: equality and participation, infrastructure, culture, and substantive representation. It was noted that gender quotas provide the basis to shift the quality of participation away from one of opportunity to one that is results-based. As there are no legislative gender quotas in Northern Ireland, affirmative action to increase women's representation still remains within the discretion of political parties. Furthermore, infrastructure arrangements at both an assembly and council level poses challenge to women's participation, especially for those with caregiving responsibilities. Sexism and misogyny have repeatedly been exposed in the political sphere in Northern Ireland, where representatives often face dismissive and undermining language from male colleagues, and where they also have limited tools at their disposal to hold unacceptable behaviour accountable. For example, in the Assembly Code of Conduct, it outlines aspirational principles for behaviour, but fails to explicitly outline unacceptable types of behaviour. Lastly, substantive representation was noted to be of importance, both in terms of women being present in politics by those we interviewed, but we also identified that there is scope to expand this by standardising gender mainstreaming practices in policy development. The culture of sexism and misogyny that exists in political institutions often spills over into how society treats women. We identified that misogyny exists on a spectrum and has a normalizing effect on gender-based violence. Violence against women in politics manifests in different ways, from the online space to the physical one, with it more often than not being laced with sectarianism in Northern Ireland. In recent years, it has become more pervasive and extreme, with the detriment of deterring women from entering political life and ultimately undermining democracy. Leading up to the 2022 Assembly election, several women candidates reported experiencing online gender-based violence, including the use of video sexual content as part of smear campaigns against them. 3 women candidates were also physically assaulted when out canvassing. Misogyny is still not considered a hate crime in Northern Ireland, and progress on the hate crime bill has stalled due to the closure of Stormont in Northern Ireland. And despite constituting 4% of Northern Ireland's population, as mentioned earlier, only 2 of the 239 candidates from the Assembly election were from a racial or ethnic background. The dominance of green and orange issues stemming from the historical conflict into today's present political system and public discourse means that minority and migrant communities tend to be overlooked in policy and decision making. And not enough is being done by political parties to increase diverse representation within their membership and candidates for election. what progress that has been made on key tools and strategies at an institutional level has failed to materialize any descriptive or substantive representation of ethnic representation in Northern Ireland. And I know I'm pressed for time. I will go faster. So we decided to issue recommendations on a macro, meso, and individual level while taking a holistic and intersecting approach. Starting with our political institutions in Northern Ireland, we believe the Assembly should legislate gender quotas with a minimum of 40% quota of women, along with a mandatory placement mechanism. As highlighted earlier, there are a series of infrastructure measures that can be implemented, including hybrid models of working, making the Assembly hours more family friendly, providing provisions for parental leave or on-site childcare facilities for Stormont and better childcare benefits for councillors. This can also include developing an unacceptable behaviours policy to help combat casual sexism and misogyny inside chambers. They can also implement prior recommendations, which was to have a centralised diversity monitoring and evaluation system within the institutions, as well as standardised gender mainstreaming practices at different levels of policy development. And lastly, there are some priority legal and strategic frameworks that can be advanced once the Assembly is hopefully restored in the autumn period, which includes the hate crime bill, the violence against women strategy, and the racial equality strategy. And they can also invest in mentoring programs in collaboration with civil society that overcome the confidence and knowledge gaps that surround politics. Lastly, invest in equality education that takes place throughout primary and secondary school levels. And of course, political parties can also take action. First and foremost, senior leadership buy-in is absolutely essential. They need to make gender equality a priority within their party strategy. Political parties can also install a gender and diversity task force, provide training, set diversity targets for their membership, develop targeted recruitment and strategies for scouting diverse members. And of course, political parties can also implement gender-sensitive infrastructures and affirmative action. And lastly, promise last slide, all too often the onus is on women to change in order to advance in politics. So we feel it is unfair to do that while without actually recognizing that male privilege exists, and that is what first needs to be tackled. Individuals can tackle their own unconscious biases as well as practice intersectional gender analytics in their own policy-making roles. And they can volunteer to mentor or sponsor young women and minority groups within their party membership, as well as demonstrate role model behaviours. And yes, that's it to conclude. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time. If not, this is my email that you can email me your questions at. Thank you.